Hello, everybody. Good afternoon to y'all. Thank you for being here at the Museum of World Treasures for another Senior Wednesday. I just want to thank Humanities Kansas for sponsoring this program today and for everything that they do to help educate and preserve history in our state. The next Senior Wednesday will also be a free Humanities Kansas sponsored presentation. But first, on May 15th, we have Professor Lewis Elliott from Oklahoma State University giving a talk at Coffee with the Curator, which is at 9 a.m. that day, called God Always Saves Endeavor, Competing Definitions of Freedom in the Twilight Years of British Slavery. Then at our next Senior Wednesday on June 4th, sponsored by Humanities Kansas, Professor Isaiah McCaffrey from Independence Community College will give his presentation, Last Stand at Rebel Creek, the Osage as Union Allies in Civil War Kansas. McCaffrey writes, as conflicts between states increased during the Civil War, both the Union and the Confederacy tried to use the Osage to achieve their own aims. Initially divided over how their people should respond in the face of escalating struggles, the Osage eventually emerged as important allies of the Union forces, thwarting an 1863 Confederate expedition tasked with reviving Southern resistance in Colorado and New Mexico territories. Today, we are delighted to be hosting Rex C. Buchanan. Born in Central Kansas, Rex received his undergraduate degree from Kansas Wesleyan University and graduate degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's the Director Emeritus of the Kansas Geological Survey at the University of Kansas, editor of Kansas Geology, and co-author of Roadside Kansas, both from the University Press of Kansas. He began his career at Kansas Geological Survey in 1978 and was the interim director from 2010 to 2016. He is the co-author of numerous books, is active in various professional organizations, and has been recognized nationally for his contributions to the field of geoscience. Without any further ado, please give a warm welcome to Rex Buchanan.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming out today. I appreciate it. And also, I do want to recognize Humanities Kansas for sponsoring this and the other talks that you all have here. As you might know, this is a kind of tough time funding-wise for the humanities and for Humanities Kansas. And so I really appreciate their support, and I would encourage you to support them in any way you can. I'm going to talk today about a book that I did with two other guys about petroglyphs out in the Smoky Hills. The book that I'm going to talk about was published by the University Press of Kansas, came out in 2019. Most of the text in the book I wrote, the photographs, almost all the photographs that I'm going to show you here this afternoon are by Burke Griggs. Burke is a professor of law at Washburn University in Topeka, but he's also a very accomplished photographer, and he did the photographs I'm going to show you. And then finally, the other co-author is Josh Swati. He is from Ellsworth County, up in the middle of the state. Josh, you may know from political circles. He was a legislator from that part of the world. And then he ran for governor, for the Democratic nomination for governor in 2018, while we were putting the finishing touches on this book. And Josh was really instrumental in getting us into some of the places that you will see photographs of as I go through this talk. He knew the landowners, and landowner permission was critical. So this book really got its start when every year in about, I don't know, February, March, when it was starting to warm up a little bit, Josh and I would lead field trips and go out to either Ellsworth County or Rice County and show people Native American rock carvings. And most people are well aware of Native American rock art, and I don't particularly like that term, but I use it sometimes. People are aware of rock art in like the American Southwest, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah. Most people are not aware of it in the state of Kansas, and so we would take people out to look at it here in Kansas. And my clicker is not forwarded. Okay, that did. Will I be? Okay, that worked. Okay, we're good. All right, so I used that term rock art earlier, and I don't particularly like that term. but it is well known by people. And rock art encompasses really two things: petroglyphs, or carvings on stone, and that's almost entirely what I'm going to talk about today. It also includes pictographs, or painting with pigment on rocks. Probably a lot of you are familiar with the cave art in Spain or France. Those are pictographs, okay? What I'm going to talk about almost entirely today are petroglyphs, which are rock carvings, all right? Now, there is a pictograph or two, a cave painting in Kansas, and this is one of the locations. This is a cave down in Comanche County, right on the Kansas-Oklahoma border, and up on the ceiling of this cave, right about where the pointer is, there's a human figure drawn in charcoal. But the real reason that I put this photograph in here is not so much because of that, but because this is very characteristic. This picture is characteristic of the kind of place that you find these features. They are very strongly associated with caves or rock overhangs and with water. This is obviously from the inside of a cave looking out, and the floor of the cave here is covered with water. I'll talk a little bit in a minute about why these features are so associated with caves and water, but this picture demonstrates that. And then finally, the other thing about this picture, that's me in the blue jean jacket there. One of the books that he mentioned in the introduction that I did was a book called Roadside Kansas with co-author Jim McCauley. And it's a guide to geology along highways in the state. And you may or may not be aware of this, but there are a lot of caves in Kansas. They're not commercial caves, they're wild caves that you have to go through, get permission to go through. Now, both Jim and I, as we worked on that book, came to the realization that we were both pretty claustrophobic. And there are a lot of caves, and so we developed a cave policy. And our cave policy was, we will enter no cave that you cannot ride through in a Jeep. And that's why this is a picture of me on the outside of the cave, okay? Okay, so one of the themes of this talk, and you're going to hear me say this over and over and over again, is that you have to be very careful how you interpret the features that I'm about to show you. I think for a 71-year-old white guy who grew up in the middle of Kansas in the 50s and 60s, to speculate on what these features mean is fraught with difficulty, okay? Because culturally, these are created by people that are very different certainly from me and probably from many of you. But when we would take people out there on these field trips to show them these features, they would walk up and the first question every time was always the same, and it was, what do they mean? What do these features mean? What do these carvings mean? All right? Over time, I became more and more reluctant to try to answer that question. This book is a good example of a project in which you know more at the beginning than you do at the end. Because almost everything that I thought I knew turned out either to be wrong or I couldn't substantiate it. And I'll show you some examples of that as we go along. But in order to write about these things in the book, even though the interpretation is kind of at a minimum, I had to classify them in some fashion, so I came up with 3 categories: anthropomorphs, or human figures, animals, and geometric figures. 3 different kinds. I'll show you examples of all of that. Now, some of the interpretation you can do, some of this is clearly telling a story. Some of these features are identity marking, and probably the most well-known example of that is a simple handprint or a carving of a hand. And probably that's, if you've seen a petroglyph or a pictograph anywhere, you've probably seen a handprint. It's maybe the most common feature of rock art that there is, and not just here, but throughout the world. And in effect, it is a way of saying, I was here, or this belongs to me. I tell people I have a friend from Indian Nations University at Haskell, which is in Lawrence, where I live, and he drives a pickup, and on the back, on the end gate of the pickup, there's a handprint. And one day I said, "What does that mean?" And he said, "That means this is mine, keep your mitts off of it," okay? Now that may be a little bit more severe interpretation than what I would make, but you get the idea, all right? Some of these features are clearly related to sky watching. One of the tribes that these are associated with is a band of the Pawnee that were very celestially oriented. They looked to the stars and to the planets. And you'll see that reflected in some of the things I'm going to show you. And then finally, I would argue that almost everything that I'm going to show you here in a minute is associated with shamanism. And a shaman is simply someone who can go to other unseen worlds that most of us can't go to. Somebody that's maybe got a little more direct pipeline to other unseen worlds than we do. Now, occasionally when I give this talk, I say I make an analogy between a shaman and a priest. And I don't really like that analogy, but I also struggle with trying to sort of explain what a shaman is. But again, I hope you get the idea. It's somebody with a little better pipeline to unseen worlds than most of us have, okay? So in some senses, you might think of the things that I'm about to show you as sacred depictions. And that's one of the reasons I don't like that term rock art, is because if I tell you something's a piece of art, you're going to look at it like a piece of art. Well, that's not really what these things are. Finally, in working on this book, there were a lot of challenges. It's hard to know how old these things are, but there are clues, and I'll talk about that as I go through some of the photographs. Tribal identification is difficult, but certainly many of these, as I mentioned already, are associated with the Pawnee, and some are associated with the Wichita Indians, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Almost all of these things that I'm about to show you are on private property, and by and large, the landowners do not want you there. That was another reason to do the book, was because you probably can't go these places. Maybe a few of them, but most of them you couldn't. And the reason that the landowners don't want you there is this issue, which is vandalism. And you're going to see a lot of that in the photographs when I finally get to them and show them to you. But these things also disappear by natural erosion. All right? And that's another reason to do the book, is sort of document what these things look like at this point in time. Finally, this book is not a guidebook. If after listening to me, you say, well, I really want to go out and see these things myself, and then you go up to Watermark Books and try and buy a copy of the book and take it home, and you see that it doesn't tell me where to go, don't blame me, all right? It's not a guidebook, and it's not a guidebook for this reason here. In order to use these photographs, we basically had to make a deal with the landowners, which is we're not going to tell people where these are for obvious reasons, okay? So it's not a guidebook. It's not exhaustive. There are a lot of things that are not in the book, a lot of glyphs that are not in the book. We just didn't have space for them all. And then finally, the royalties for this book go to, and it was published by the University Press of Kansas, the royalties go to the County Historical Society museums in Rice County and Ellsworth County, where Josh and I are from, and to the Native American Rights Fund in Boulder, Colorado. So I'm not in this for the money, okay? So with that, let's talk about the Smoky Hills a little bit. This is a map that shows petroglyph locations roughly by triangles in the state. Here's that Comanche County cave I showed you the picture of earlier, and you can see that most of these are clustered up in Russell County, Rice County, Lincoln County, Ottawa County, up in that part of the world. That's the part of the world that's associated with the Smoky Hills. It's shown here in kind of a tan or brown color. And the outcropping rock there is a sandstone. There are several types of outcropping rock, but the one we're going to be concerned with today is a sandstone. It's called the Dakota Formation. And I know that you know this formation, whether you know it or not, because this is the outcropping rock at Coronado Heights. And I'm sure a lot of you have been past Coronado Heights, just up north of Lindsborg, okay? The hills in western part of Saline County and Ellsworth County, and as you go on west that are capped with sandstone, that's the Dakota Formation, and that's what almost all of the features that I'm about to show you are carved onto, okay? And by the way, the Dakota is Cretaceous in age, and that's the same age as some of the, we were just downstairs looking at some of the fossils that you all have in this museum here. The big Zaphactinus fish, that there's a great fossil downstairs. That's a Cretaceous age fish. It's from here in Kansas. This sand is kind of beach sand, old river channel sand along the edge of that sea that those marine fish and reptiles lived in. Okay, so, whoops. All right. In the book, we started every chapter with a setting photograph, sort of give you the lay of the land, because I'm convinced that these features are carved where they are for very good reasons. And I mentioned caves or rock overhangs, and I mentioned water before. So they are where they are for good reasons, even if I can't always explain exactly what those reasons are. But this is an example of that. This is a location in Russell County, just south of the little town of Wilson, that probably some of you are familiar with. There are petroglyphs all up and down this bluff of sandstone, and just off to the right of where this picture was taken is the Smoky Hill River. Again, connection with water. So let's look at some of them up and down that bluff. This is kind of a panel, and I'm going to zoom in on some stuff here in a second, but I wanted to give you a taste of a couple of things here. One is, I talked before about vandalism. Those squares represent places where people decided they were going to take the petroglyph home, all right? So they sort of cut behind it and removed the sandstone glyph. Now, I also put this slide in here because all three types, all three categories that I mentioned are in this photo, in this slide. This zigzag line is an example of a geometric figure. There's a human figure right here, and I'll show you a close-up of that so you can see it better. And then I know you probably can't see it, but off to the right is a bird. So all three types in this area here. This is what one of these looks like when it's removed. This is not from the location I just showed you. This is from the Historical Society Museum, the State Historical Society Museum in Topeka. They didn't do this. Somebody removed it and eventually donated it to the museum. But this is what one of these features looks like if you remove it from the context. Here is a close-up of the human figure from that previous panel. Here is that zigzag line that you could probably see. So here's the person, and this is a very characteristic depiction of a person, of the way that they are depicted in these petroglyphs. They are, the people typically are looking out at you. They're not in profile. They're looking out at you. Very often they have their hands raised, the way this person does, even to the point where you can see the fingers on the hands there and down here. Rectangular body with a kind of a sash in this case, but this is a very typical depiction of a human, all right? This person ahead with a top knot, but probably what is most noticeable about this is this spear or lance extending from the side of the person, obviously telling a story about that. Now, this is the beginning of the audience participation part of this program, because you guys have got great snacks here, I got to tell you. And in order to make sure you're awake, I'm going to ask you questions from time to time, and I'm going to start with this one. So there are three human figures in this one. 1, 2, 3. What's most noticeable about the one in the upper left? The hat? What else? Anything else? The uniform. There you go. Stripes on the arms and the legs. Okay. Now, when you do a book like this, because it's published by the University Press, as part of the process of publishing the book, they send the book out for what they call peer review, which is basically they find experts in the field, the experts review what you wrote, and if you have to pass muster in order to publish the book. And so I wrote this caption and I said, this is the depiction of a soldier. The peer reviewer wrote back and said, you don't know that. What you do know is it's a person wearing a military uniform. Now, you might say, well, aren't those the same thing? Well, no, they are not. And I'll give you an example here in a minute. So it's a person wearing a military uniform. What that does is tell us something about the age of this carving, because there's probably not anybody out here wearing a military uniform prior to about 1800. In fact, it's probably after that. So that helps us at least surmise that this is post-1800 when this is carved, a very recent carving, okay? You know, sometimes I sort of skip over this slide, but I'm gonna talk about it a little bit because it's from here in Wichita, because we're here in Wichita. When I was working on the caption for this petroglyph, and so this is, again, another anthropomorph, square body. The head's been mostly destroyed, but it's looking out at you with a lance in one arm and a hatchet or an axe in the other arm. And the other part that's real noticeable here are these two parallel lines that the peer reviewer associated with what he called a staked warrior. In some Plains tribes tradition, there was a tradition of using a rope either around your waist or your shoulders, and then staking the other end of the rope into the ground. In effect, it was a way of making sure you were going to stay put. You were going to fight or die or win or lose, but the one thing you were not going to do was run away, because you couldn't, all right? When I was working on this, I got a note from a good friend of mine. His sister worked at the Special Collections Library here at Wichita State University. Her name was Mary Nelson. If any of you, some of you know who Mary was? She really knew the collection here at Wichita State inside out. And when she found out I was working on this book, because her brother and I were good friends, she sent me a digital version of James R. Mead's notebooks, and James R. Mead was one of the founders of Wichita, notebook, including a bunch of drawings of these exact petroglyphs. And in fact, the day that I was writing the caption for this photograph, she sent me that connection, and one of the drawings in Mead's notebook is of this petroglyph, which I thought was really cool, and the fact that Mary did that the same day was real meaningful to me. She has since passed away, but she was a real treasure here and very, very helpful. Okay, we'll get out of Russell County, we'll go up to Ellsworth County, this cave up on top of a hill in Russell County. There's a spring down here. And on the side of this cave, it may be a little hard to see because it's dark, but there's this bird. Okay, the head up here, the body here, big oversized feet here. This is a big carving, about 26, 28 inches this way, 26 inches up and down. And the nice thing is in this cave, there's relatively little graffiti. This is in pretty pristine shape. It's a sandhill crane, according to people that know their birds. Okay, now I'm going to tell you a story. So when I was working on this book one winter day, my wife and I were at the Art Museum in Lawrence, at the KU Art Museum. And I saw a painting that I had never really noticed before, and it was a Native American with his head severed from his body. And I read the label, and it said Ellsworth County, Kansas, 1868. So I do some looking at the story behind the label, and the painting is based on this. In the winter of 1868, there's a group of 6 Pawnee scouts. They are working for the U.S. Army. Now that may sound antithetical to you, but it's not. It was not unusual for members of one tribe to work for the Army if the Army was attacking one of their enemies. It's kind of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, you people in your phones are. So the 6 scouts are working for the US military. And I said before, that's an example of where somebody may be wearing a military uniform, but is not necessarily a member of not necessarily a soldier, okay? So the Pawnee are working for the US Army. They're headed either to or from Nebraska, which is where they really live at this point. And they're going through Ellsworth County, and the local residents are frightened by the fact that there are 6 Indians there. They call out the Army from Fort Harker, which is in the town of Canopolis. And the Army comes out and chases the scouts up into a cave or a rock overhang and kills all 6 of them, okay? Now, I can't tell you with 1,000% certainty that this is where that occurred, but I can say it with about 99% certainty, all right? 2 or 3 days after they killed those scouts, the post surgeon from Fort Harker came out and cut the heads off of the bodies and sent the heads to Washington, D.C. for so-called ethnographic study, all right? Now, that is not a pretty story, obviously. I grew up about 25 miles from this location, and I'd been to this cave a lot of times leading geology field trips. I had never heard that story till I saw that painting at the Art Museum in Lawrence. Josh Slotty, one of my co-authors, grew up about 10 miles from this location. One of his relatives owns this property, and Josh had never heard that story, okay? Now, one of my big motivations for wanting to do this book is I grew up out here. I played and fished I had these features right in my own backyard, but nobody could tell me anything about them. And I found that intensely frustrating, even as a kid. I tell people that when I graduated from high school, I think I knew more about the Magna Carta and the kings and queens of France than I knew about the people that lived where I grew up only 200 years previously. And even as a high school kid, that bothered me. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to do this book. So this is the cave probably where that took place. This front part is eroded away. This is the outside of that cave as it's depicted in 1867. This is a photograph taken by a Civil War photographer named Alexander Gardner. And again, I know that you know Alexander Gardner, whether you know that you know Alexander Gardner or not. He took the last portrait of Abraham Lincoln. And it's a portrait. There was a crack in the photographic plate that goes through Lincoln's head. That was an Alexander Gardner photograph, all right? In 1867, he comes through Kansas on the Kansas Pacific Railroad. They've hired him to take pictures in order to lure people to come out and settle in this part of the world. This is a picture at that cave. The petroglyph, whoops, I keep pushing the wrong button here. The petroglyph on the side of the cave here is a reclining figure about 6 or 7 feet long. It's a anthropomorph. You can see the head with the eyes and rays coming out of the head. It's superimposed over a snake or a serpent. And I'll talk about that motif in a little bit. The nice thing about this 1867 photograph is that you know that almost everything shown in this photograph is native. Really, in 1867, white people haven't had time to come out here and carve their initials and their names. So this is a valuable photograph. This is what that looks like today. In 1995, that whole thing spalled off, naturally eroded away and collapsed. And yeah, when I give this talk, people react the same way. They always sort of go, oh, that's a shame. And yeah, it is a shame. But don't assume that people that carved these viewed them as permanent features of the landscape. Maybe they did, but maybe they didn't. I don't know. You can't assume when it comes to these things. Inside the cave, various geometric figures, like this circle. But what I really want to call your attention to is this cross up there in the upper left-hand corner. The Pawnee depicted stars not the way you or I might draw them, you know, like a 5-point star on a flag. I don't see a flag in here, but you know what I mean. Everybody draws a 5-point star, or at least we do. The Pawnee depicted them with a simple cross, okay? And we know that. Have any of you ever been to the Pawnee Indian Village Museum west of Belleville? One person? Holy cow. I just wrote an article about this place for Kansas Magazine, most recent edition of the magazine. I think it is one of the great museums in the state of Kansas, if not the United States. It's a museum built over the top of a Pawnee lodge. One of the things I like is if you go up there, you'll probably be the only person there. And it is a really striking place, very, very well done. And they have a photograph of a Pawnee star chart. In effect, it's the depiction of the constellations as the Pawnee saw them, not as the way we might see them, okay? And they depict stars with crosses. Now, this is a photograph of the star chart. The original is in the Field Museum in Chicago, and it's no longer on display because it's a sacred item. But again, they always depict stars with a cross, and that's one of the 2 or 3 most common glyphs you'll see out in the hills. Okay, this is a location in Ellsworth County that a lot of stuff going on here. Again, a couple of these panels that have been removed. My guess is that here's another human figure just to the left of the squares removed. But my guess is that somebody was going to take the human figure with them and then thought better of it for whatever reason. Another human figure up here, again, looking out at you with arms raised. There's another one down here at the base of this bluff. But the big feature for me here is this bison. You can see the head with the horns and hair on the back, the body there. Now, when this book came out in the fall of 2019, I got a phone call from my son's junior high history teacher. And my son is like in his mid or upper 30s now. I guess I should know how old he is, but I don't. Anyway, I got a phone call from his junior high history teacher, who I was amazed was still teaching, and he said, I would like you to come out and talk about your book, because a lot of students at my son's junior high history teacher, or my son's junior high, were connected with Haskell Indian Nations University. So I said, sure. What he neglected to tell me was that he taught 4 sections of junior high history, not just 1. So I had signed up to give this talk 4 times. Now, I'm not the brightest guy in the world, but I also do remember something of where my brain was when I was in junior high, and it was not here. And so I had a fair amount of trepidation about giving this talk, and so what I decided to do was, instead of what we're doing here today, I told them, here's what we're looking at, and then I just would put up slides and have them come up and tell me what they saw. And what I did that day was, some of you are probably like this. So when you're in like junior high and high school, it kind of divides into 2 types of students. And one half of them are the kids that sit on the front row, and when the teacher asks a question, they jump, put their hand up and me, me, me. Those are not my people. My people are at the back of the room when the teacher asks a question, doing this. Just putting their head down, praying to God that they're not called upon. So I decided that day I was going to, I lost my other microphone. I may have to have you help me get this back on. Oops, there it goes. Is it? Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So, so I asked the kids at the back of the class, come up and tell me what you see. All right? And no, I wasn't leading them in any fashion. I just said, tell me what you see. 3 of the 4 sections, when they came up here, they did not talk about the person or the missing pieces. They did not talk about the bison. What they talked about is a feature that you may not even be able to see on the flank of the bison, which is one of those handprints. 3 of the 4 came up, and that's what they pointed to. All right, I'll come back to that in just a second. Here's a close-up of those 2 panels that have been removed right here. This is obviously digitally enhanced to pull color out, and the reason is because of this figure here. You can see a human figure. This is a breastplate. Here are the arms, headdress with bison horns coming out of it. But what's particularly noticeable with this enhancement is the red coloration on the face. This is a pictograph, pigment, a painting, and a carving both. Nobody had really documented that till we put this book out. Also note this circular feature here. I'll come back to it in just a second. We're getting close to the end here. I want a couple of locations. This is still in Ellsworth County. I'm going to show you the inside of this little cave in a second. Before I do that, here is a photograph from outside the cave of a boulder with a horse that I love this because it is so few lines, well, really only half a dozen lines altogether, and yet you know not only what this is, but you see very alert. The ears are up, the eyes open. This is a very alert horse, done with, I think, an elegant simplicity of lines. I love this photograph. So inside that rock overhang I was showing you are these features. Now this rock overhang only goes back 6-7 feet, but it's very dark back there. I mean, it's almost pitch dark. And Burke, the photographer, when he took this photograph, he was using film. He wasn't doing these digitally. He was using film. He had to leave this exposure open for like 4.5 or 5 minutes to get enough light in order to take this photograph. The landowner had told us that we had one chance to come onto the land. The landowner said, we'll let you do this once, but you're not coming back. So Burke knew that I really wanted this photograph. He told me later he was under a lot of stress, but I really appreciated what he got here. There's several things going on. The white stuff is lichen that's growing on the inside of this rock overhang in the dark. There's this anthropomorph, which is really an odd looking figure that I've never quite known what to make of. You can see the hands and the fingers there, an oddly shaped body and head though. And then originally I had interpreted this as another beginning of another anthropomorph or human figure, but when I gave this talk in Lawrence one day, one of the folks from Haskell came up and said that they thought that this was a depiction of a flag or a guidon. Cavalry would carry these flags with kind of a notch out of them, and I think that's probably more correct. What's really cool about this spot to me is it's so tight that when you go back into this spot and you set to look at these features, you know that you are sitting in the exact spot the person sat when they created these. And that is a very powerful feeling. So powerful, it's really kind of hard for me to describe how meaningful it is. This is a couple miles from where I grew up. Now we're in Rice County, and there's a spring at the base of this bluff of sandstone, and up above that spring, remember the circular feature that you could see a little bit of in the digitally enhanced photograph? This is another one of those. This is about 25 miles from where that bison was, but the same number of concentric rings in this circle. Both of them have this lance or spear coming out from behind it, almost at exactly the same angle. This is probably the depiction of a shield, that there were some Plains tribes that carried shields with them, usually made out of buffalo hide, with them as they moved about. And that's probably what this is depicting. When I was a kid, you could still see some feet down below there. That's eroded away naturally. And then somebody took a pot shot with a rifle at this location, and that's what that scar is. Okay, just to the right is this feature. Now again, so what I really want to talk about is this feature right here. When I was writing about this, I interpreted this again as a human figure or anthropomorph. Now, when I was working on the book, I invited the Pawnee to come up and go out into the field with me and look at these things. And you remember the story I told you about the 6 scouts that were killed? That was the first place that I took the Pawnee to, and I'll guarantee you they knew that story. They didn't know exactly where it occurred, but they knew the story behind it. It was not history to them. It was yesterday to them. The other tribe these things are associated with are the Wichita Indians, the Quivira Indians, all right? This is the location where in 1541, Coronado is going through Kansas. This is up in Rice County. Coronado is going through Kansas. He runs into a group of people in lodges. These are the Quivira or Wichita Indians. They're up there at that time. So I talked to the Wichitas about going into the field with me to look at these things, and they were not interested. So I took the photographs and I went to Anadarko, Oklahoma, which is where their reservation is. And we went through these one by one. And by and large, the Wichita were not interested until we came to this. And then they did want to talk. Now, I mentioned I interpreted this as an anthropomorph largely because of those arms up in the air. That's not what the Wichita said. Wichita said this is not a person, it's something else. What do you think they said it was? Somebody said it. Say it louder. Lizard, yeah, exactly. And I've given this talk a lot of times. I've looked at this picture a lot. And I don't see it, but I believe it because that's what the Wichita said. Excuse me. And you remember those 4 sections of junior high kids? 3 of the 4 walked up, pointed at that, and said, lizard. What that tells me is that what you see depends a lot on who you are. And you can't inflict your perspective of the world onto these features, all right? You have to approach this with a much more open mind. I would guess this feature is really old because the Wichita were up there in the 1500s and then they eventually migrate south to Oklahoma and Texas. But because they did encounter Coronado there, I would guess this is probably 500 or 600 years old. It's very dense, hard sandstone at this location. This feature is very deeply incised into the rock, and most importantly, stylistically, it's completely different than anything else I've showed you today. So I would guess that this is much older and it's Wichita as opposed to Pawnee. A couple miles south of that location is this feature. It's not a petroglyph, it's what's called an intaglio. Some of you are probably familiar with mound building Indians. In the upper Mississippi River Valley, the indigenous people built features out by mounding soil up. It's pretty common. An intaglio is where they created features by digging the ground out. This is a drone photograph, and for scale, that's a Jeep. It's about 150 feet long, and it may be a little hard to appreciate from that photograph, but from this one you can see it much more clearly. This is an aerial photograph. The feature was covered with lime by the guy that took this photograph, and it pretty clearly depicts a snake. Where can snakes go? They can go into the underground, places you and I can't ordinarily go. Where do caves and springs go? They go into the underground. There are glimpses of the underground in places we can't ordinarily see it. So there's a strong association, I think, between snakes and between these features and where these features are. Now, this one, like I said, is big. It's about 150 feet long. And it also has an egg in its mouth, and there's a very similar mound like that in other parts of the Mississippi River Valley. We'll finish up at this location. This is about a mile from where I grew up, again, a bluff of sandstone that's completely covered with glyphs down here. Here are a few of them, but in particular, this one here is a thunderbird, a very common motif in, if you want to call it rock art, in Native American imagery in general in the US, legs and arms. But really what's more interesting to me here are these three features, 1, 2, 3, and especially this one here. Again, what I love about this is it's really just two lines, right? And yet you know what it is. I mean, yeah, there's some cross-hatching on the tail and there are feet down here if you look close enough, but really that's two lines. That's not easily done to convey the essence of an animal with two simple lines. And here, to sort of finish up, this is back up in Ellsworth County. Here is another, and I know this may be a little hard to see because it's eroded away at the top, but another bird that looks very much like the one I just showed you, that's just basically made out of two lines, and it's superimposed over the top of another serpent with its jaws open here, kind of like that intaglia I showed you. I'll skip over that slide. This is Burke, the guy that took these photographs, and I put this in here just to show that these were not easy working conditions. We did most of the work on this book in the winter time, so we wouldn't have to deal with ticks and chiggers and poison ivy. But some of these are very steep locations, and this is one. And Burke, I was telling Burke about this just last night. While Burke was taking these photographs, I would look around for other petroglyphs for him to take pictures of in case we hadn't seen them all. And this particular bluff, I had just gotten back from a long field trip at the Grand Canyon. I'd been down there for like 2 weeks and done a lot of hiking in the Grand Canyon. So I started up at the top of this bluff, and it's about 30 or 40 feet up and down here altogether. And I was looking for petroglyphs, and I came over the front of this bluff, and I got about 10 feet down, and I realized I couldn't find any place to put my feet to go any further, and then I couldn't figure out how to get back up. Now, I don't know if any of you have had this experience or not, but it's not a pleasant feeling. And what was odd was what went through my brain. And the first thought I had was, well, this is great. I just got back from the Grand Canyon, and all these hairy places to hike, and now I'm going to fall to my death in Kansas. And then I get to thinking, I'm going to have like the most embarrassing obituary ever written. Now stop and think about this. I'm worried about my obituary, even though I'm going to be dead. What kind of human being is so, that worries about that? Wouldn't you think you would be worried about how to get the hell out of there as opposed to being embarrassed after you're no longer here? Anyway, as you might have guessed, I did figure out how to get back up, and I didn't die, but it did sort of give me some sense of how insecure I must really be as a human being. Here's some additional references if you'd like to read more about any of this. The one that I would really, if you're interested particularly in the European component of this book here, The Mind in the Cave, I think is just terrific. I've seen some of the cave paintings in France in the caves, and they are spectacular features. And with that, I think that's the end of it. Again, if you're interested in a copy of the book, the last time it was at Watermark a couple of months ago, I know they had a copy or two. You can order it from University Press, who published it. And if worse comes to worse, there's always Amazon. So with that, I appreciate the chance to come down today. And if you've got any questions or comments, I'm more than happy to listen. Sure.
You wanted the soldier early on.
Mm-hmm.
You said it was made after 1800.
Yeah.
Couldn't it have been a soldier or a Spanish explorer from Coronados party?
You know,
And
and
often slash C's looks like that style.
it could have been. Yeah. I was going to see if I could get back to that, but I may not be able to do it. And one thing that would support your interpretation, I don't know if I can do this or not. There was also one of those figures that had boots that looked very Spanish. And in theory, that's true, yeah. There, whoops, uh-oh, I pushed the button. Look at that. It's like it's alive. Okay, I promise I'll quit doing this as soon as I get back to that. The boots in particular and pants that remind me of what you said are there as well, yeah. And that's certainly possible. I would say because of the location where this one is, this is quite a ways north of, this would be 50 or 60 miles north of where Coronado came through. That doesn't mean it couldn't be a depiction of it, but that would lead me to say that's not right, but.
What could have been told tales?
Exactly, well, or somebody remembered it, yeah, it could be, absolutely, yeah.
Is there any depiction of mythological bird?
Of the what?
Mythological bird.
No, huh?
Got a question here.
Oops, oh, I'm sorry, okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'm one of those junior high history teachers. But what I was curious about is because the landowners say, you know, like, we don't really want you here, how are you hearing about that? How are you hearing about them? And then is this just like word of mouth, or how are we hearing about these petroglyphs throughout the world, basically?
By the way, God bless you for being a junior high teacher.
Thank you.
Because
I need all the prayers I can get.
I have, you had to deal with kids like me, and nobody should. And I'm just,
Yeah.
if I could go back and apologize to my junior high teachers, I would. I apologize.
This is my self-care. I come to the
Is that right?
by myself so I can be a normal human being.
Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking about. I do know what I was thinking about junior high. Anyway, the question, a lot of these features, like where I grew up and where Josh grew up, they are well known by locals, okay? And so we knew about them, even if nobody knew what they meant, okay? So they were pretty well known. And then as we began to work on this project, the word sort of spread and people talked to us about other locations and told us about them. So they are well known locally. And in a lot of these cases, if you were to call one of these landowners and say, can I come out and look? Some of them would say yes. Most of them would not, but some of them would. I even did a fairly large public field trip to the one of the lizard summer before last that some folks out there organized. There's also a database at the Kansas State Historical Society of all these features. And it's not a public database, but they gave me access to it while I was working on the book, and you could use those. I went to some of the other literature. There was a book that I showed by a guy named Waldo Weedle, who's a grand old man of Kansas archaeology, and his book had a couple of locations in it that I used to go find some things. I mean, there's a little bit of catch as catch can going on here, but a variety of ways to get to them. Yeah.
Well, do you want to go on another field trip?
Well, I go on field trips all the time.
No, I would let them all take
Take the junior high kids.
Oh, I see. You know, I thought I had made clear my opinion of junior high kids, but apparently I have failed miserably. I'm sure I don't know what kids are like. I'm sure they're perfectly, are they? My older brother taught high school English for like 35 years, and he has 4 kids, and he was telling me it got real hard to figure out names for all of them because you'd come up with a name for one of them, and then you would associate that name with some knothead kid that you'd had in school, and you didn't want to be reminded, so that name went out. He got pretty desperate for names before they quit having kids. I'm sorry, this has nothing to do. Are you people enjoying this little conversation over here? I don't know what this is.
Got another question for you here.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, how do you date it? How do you even, just by what the image is?
You have to surmise, yeah. Because, okay, here's an example. Okay, I showed you a picture, a carving of a horse. There were not horses on the plains prior to 1541, unless you go back to the Pleistocene, and then there weren't any people here to speak of, okay? So any depiction of a horse is going to be post-1541 ironclad. There's no give on that. Now, we might argue 200 versus 400 here, but we're not going to argue about that. So everything that I showed you is going to be post-1541. It has to be. When did they quit? When they left, or when they were removed? Well, in the Pawnee, it's in the late 1860s, early 1870s. Now, there are a lot of additional carvings that white people have done. One of them there's one of James R. Mead, one of the founders of Wichita, up at Canopolis. I thought it was pretty cool to see that, where he had carved his name up there. There's one by Henry Stanley. You all know the story of Africa and Dr. Livingston, I presume. The guy that said that was Henry Stanley. He came through here in 1872. I found what I'm sure is a legitimate autograph, whatever you want to call it, in that sandstone. And a lot of times the question people ask, the mixed question people ask is, well, how do you differentiate between indigenous carvings and modern carvings by white people? Now, when I give this talk with Burke one time, Burke is a lawyer. And when that question got asked, Burke quoted a Supreme Court justice, and I don't remember which one because I'm not a lawyer, proudly enough. And one of the Supreme Court justices, in hearing a case on pornography one time, said, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it, okay? It's very similar when I look at these things. I cannot always tell you exactly how I know that it's indigenous, but with one exception, I know, okay? Stylistically, they're very, very different from what your average high school kid would carve into a rock if they went out there. I can just see it, okay? And some styles, like the way Pawnee depict horses' legs, are very characteristic of the Pawnee. It's an art style, if you want to use that term again. So there are a lot of clues. But again, you have to be very careful about getting out in front of your skis and overstating what you really know. Yeah.
Are any of your slides from the Horse Thief Canyon area of Canopolis Lake?
I didn't put that location in here. She asked, Horse Thief Canyon is a well-known location, and there's a place called kind of Indian Hill up in that vicinity, and we have a chapter on that in the book. I didn't put any of those slides in here, but that we do have a chapter because that's one of the most extensive locations of glyphs in the entire state. Yeah.
Is it still easily accessible?
It is not easily accessible. It's on public property in theory, Corps of Engineers property, but the Corps really doesn't want you there, partly because of concern about vandalism, but also safety. I can tell you that bluff is very steep, it's very sandy. I took a field trip there one time and decided I was never going to do it again because it's too easy to get hurt. So you can hike over there from the trailhead at Horse Thief Canyon, but I would not recommend it. Now, they do have casts, recreations of those petroglyphs from that location at the Corps office building in Canopolis. If you want to see those, that's how. It's a lot easier than a 2-mile hike to try to go look at these things on the ground. Now, I will say, I just saw this morning about some cuts in the budget of the Army Corps of Engineers, so how much longer that office is going to be open, I don't know. But I can tell you the day we did that, the photographs for that chapter that in the book, it was in, that unfortunately was in August, and it was a long, miserable day hiking over there, spending the entire day taking those pictures. And we got done, we got ready to hike back, and Burke said, because this is right on the edge of Canopolis Lake, Burke said, let's flag down a boat and get them to haul us over here. I said, man, that's not how it works. You know, in geology, you walk in, you walk out. And Burke basically told me to go to hell. We did take a boat back that day. And it probably was the better part of valor, but it still strikes me as wrong somehow. He and I very strong, we argue about that to this day. I will hang around here for another minute or two. If you've got any other questions or comments, anything else you want to visit about, I'll be around here for just a little bit. But again, thank you all for coming out. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thanks again, Rex. We appreciate you being here and telling this fascinating history about things that I certainly didn't learn about in school. And like you said, I know more about the kings and queens of France than I did about these things in our own state, which is such an important and wonderful treasure to have. So thank you very much for your time talking about that. Come out to our next Senior Wednesday and also our next Coffee with the Curator before that. What date did I say? The May 15th is Coffee with the Curator. If y'all are morning people, come out to that event. And then our next Senior Wednesday is again sponsored by Humanities Kansas, so that will be free to the public as well. Thank you all for coming out and have a wonderful afternoon.